And good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and I do appreciate you being with me so very, very much. It's a good day, it really is. But I do thank you for being with me. And I'm going to chiropractor in the morning. This is Sunday morning as I film this, and I'm going to be at the chiropractor's office when he opens up in the morning. This gets old really, really, really fast. It's one of those type of things, where it's just under the wing, and every time you take a breath, it's kind of like a knife. Oh yeah, okay. All right. So, the question of the day is, as we continue our examination of the feast days of Israel, and we're focused on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, but the Hebrews writer says in Hebrews chapter 9, and he lays out the actions of the high priest on the Day of Atonement. The high priest offered the sacrifice. The high priest entered into the most holy place. There, sprinkled the blood on the Halysterion, the mercy seat, and he came back out to announce salvation. Well, it seems that there are some people who are not satisfied with that explanation in regard to the atoning work of Jesus. They say that can't be true. They tell us that the atonement was finished at the cross. Or they now tell us the atonement was finished when Jesus ascended into the most holy place. Well, at least that's slightly more accurate. Not totally accurate, but certainly it's more accurate than saying that the atonement was finished at the cross. As I pointed out yesterday, ladies and gentlemen, a new definition is being given to salvation. Now, let me say this, all right? The Greek word soterion, salvation, can have different definitions. It all depends on context. Okay? You cannot just arbitrarily say, oh, look, Hebrews 9:28, to those who eagerly expect him, he shall appear again apart from sin for salvation. And you just cannot just arbitrarily say, oh, look, there's a passage over here where soterion, salvation, doesn't mean forgiveness of sin. Therefore, that can't be what it means over here. That's an illegitimate totality transfer, which is a logical fallacy. Just because the same word is used in both contexts doesn't mean that the same word means the same in both contexts. Context is king. Does that not mean that you, generally speaking, have a basic primary definition? Well, of course nobody's denying that. Soterion can be defined as deliverance from. Doesn't tell you what it's deliverance from, but it's deliverance from, escape from, whatever. So it's not sufficient. And you see, there are all sorts of reasons why some people are taking this view. They claim, well, Preston, if you say that the atonement was not finished until the Parousia, you're disparaging the cross. What? The very first time I heard that, I was like, argumentum ad desperatum. Yeah, that's what that is. That's nonsense. That's like saying, boy, when they put the last shingle on the roof, my house is going to be finished. Oh, that's disparaging laying the foundation, Preston. What? Ladies and gentlemen, the atonement was a process. Sacrifice, entrance into the most holy place, coming out of the most holy place. That's the way the Jews understood it for 1,500 years. And I can hear some people say right now, oh, well, the Jews are just a bunch of unbelievers. Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot make such broad, wide generalizations. And, when an argument comes back to bite us, say, oh, well, that's Jews are a bunch of unbelievers. The Jews believed in the inspiration of Scripture. They're just a bunch of unbelievers, therefore we can't accept that. The Jews believed that a Messiah was going to come, be born of a virgin, perform miracles, save the lost. They're a bunch of unbelievers. Therefore, they were wrong in all that. You see how ridiculous of an argument that is? I understand that the Jews rejected the message of Jesus. That doesn't mean they weren't looking for the Messiah. My point is that the Jews understood and taught for 1,500 years that the Day of Atonement was a process. Sacrifice, entrance into the most holy place, coming out of the most holy place. I have asked Jewish rabbis, could it possibly be said, what do the ancient commentaries say about the Day of Atonement? Was the atonement completed at the moment of the sacrifice for sin? No. Was the atonement process completed when the high priest went in the most holy place? It's ridiculous. The atonement was not completed until the high priest came out. So the question is, did the Jews completely, teetotally misunderstand the process for 1,500 years? Now, if you're going to claim that they did, you're going to have to prove that they did. Because that's the pattern, that's the typological pattern that the writer of Hebrews is setting forth to compare with Jesus' actions as the great high priest. And as I pointed out yesterday, those who are seeking to redefine the word salvation in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 28, are in one way tacitly admitting, well, he was going to come for some kind of salvation. The only question is, what kind of salvation was to be linked with the parousia of Christ, the coming of Christ, the epiphany of Christ. Now, for integrity's sake, for objectivity's sake, we have to understand that 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, Paul promised the Thessalonians, being persecuted by the Jews, it is a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation those who are troubling you, and to give to you who are being troubled relief when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven. Well, this is the second coming of Christ. What was the second coming of Christ going to do on one level? Give relief from persecution. And I can just almost read, it's being typed right now, I can almost read the people saying, see, you're admitting that Hebrews chapter 9, verse 28 involved physical salvation. Well, I never denied that it involved it. What I deny is that that's all it involved. That's the point. The real question is, can those who are making the argument that the salvation of Hebrews 9:28 justify claiming that it was only about physical deliverance from the Neronian persecution or physical deliverance from the war? And can they prove that it was at some mythical rapture? By the way, I have folks all the time ask me if I've done anything on the AD 70 rapture theory, and yes, I have. In my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings, I don't have a copy of it in here with me right now, but I have an entire chapter addressing that doctrine. I do not believe it's biblical. I do not believe it has any merit whatsoever. And so I was asked to address the issue. So I did. I have had any number of people tell me, well, that's the end of that. That destroys that rapture theory. So do yourself a favor. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. Go go to my store and order the book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air. Now, if you do that and you send me a note that says you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, I'll refund your shipping, and that will save you $7.50. Okay? But for those who have asked me if I have addressed the rapture doctrine, the answer is yes, and it's in that book. It's quite a lengthy discussion. It could have been a small book within itself, but I wasn't going to take that much more time. All right. So, again, for objectivity's sake, I have not said, never have said, that the parousia of Christ did not involve physical deliverance. I actually wrote a little book in flaming fire affirming that the second coming of Christ was to give relief from persecution. So nobody can accuse me of, shall we say, duplicity here. I'm saying that it was more than physical deliverance. I am saying that it included the consummation of the atonement. Now, I want you to notice the book of Romans. The book of Romans contains what can be called an inclusio. An inclusio, the word inclusio is kind of a fancy literary term and a theological term. It's used theologically by many scholars. And it means you've got a reference here and you've got a reference here, and everything in between is included in the discussion of this subject. Same subject. There may be different nuances, but all of those nuances are included in the discussion of that subject. So here's what I mean. Romans 1:16. I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation. Now, would anyone want to argue that the only thing that the gospel was for was physical deliverance from Neronian persecution, or that it was for the exclusive purpose of deliverance from the Jewish war? Well, that would be kind of ridiculous, wouldn't it? Of course it would be. Because it's the power of God to salvation to the Jew first, then to the Greek. This is an all-encompassing salvation. Not just Jews, not just Israelites, but the Greeks, who are not the Jews and who are not Israel either. So, the gospel is for salvation. Then we go to Romans chapter 13, verse 11 and following. And now do this, Paul said, knowing the time, and it's literally knowing the hour. It is high time to awake out of sleep, for now is our salvation nearer than when we first believed. Now, right square, not exactly squarely in the middle, but earlier in the book, Paul has discussed salvation. Brethren, I tell you a mystery, that blindness in part has happened unto Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so, all Israel shall be saved. Ooh, let's see here. I'm pretty sure that no one would want to make the argument that all Israel was just delivered from the Neronian persecution. I'm pretty sure no one would want to make the argument that all Israel was delivered from the Jewish war. And I'm pretty sure that no one would want to argue that all Israel was raptured in AD 66. See the problem? And to drive that home, Paul says, all Israel shall be saved, as it is written, and he quotes from Isaiah 27, 9 and following, and Isaiah 59, 17 and following, or 19 and following, excuse me. Well, in verse 19 and following, the Lord puts on his garments of vengeance, and he says, surely I will repay. I will repay vengeance to my adversary, And then he says, for this is my covenant when I take away their sin. So the parousia of Isaiah 59, which would be fulfilled at the coming of Christ of Romans chapter 11, would be the time of the taking away of sin. That's the atonement. You see the issue here? So we have Romans 1:16, the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. Romans chapter 11, the coming of the Lord for salvation at the time of the taking away of sin. And you have Romans 13, now is our salvation nearer than when we first believed. Now, is the coming of the Lord for salvation, Romans 11, in fulfillment of Isaiah 59, a different coming of the Lord from that of Hebrews chapter 9, verse 28? Well, if they're the same coming, then what we have is not an either-or situation. It is not either to deliver them from the Neronian persecution or it's nothing. No. No. It's not either-or. It's a deliverance of the saints from persecution, 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, but it is also the time of the taking away of sin, which is the consummation of the atonement. So when those who want to redefine salvation in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 28, when they say, oh, well, yeah, that's in AD 66. Well, it wasn't in AD 66 in the first place. That's anachronistic. Matthew 24, 30 and 31 clears that up real well. Okay? Matthew 24, 30 and 31 didn't happen in AD 66. But that coming of the Lord for salvation of Romans chapter 11 is for the taking away of sin. That is the consummation of the atonement. But again, when those who want to redefine salvation in Hebrews 9:28, when they say, oh yeah, that's the second coming of Christ. Well, if it's the second coming of Christ, then it's Romans 11. But Romans 11 is the time of the taking away of Israel's sin, to consummate the atonement. So while these folks, good folks as they are trying to isolate and exclusively define salvation in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 28 as one thing, they are being myopic, atomistic. They're focusing on only one aspect of salvation to the exclusion of the real focus of the atonement. And I'm completely out of time today. Thank you so much for joining me here on Morning Musings. Be sure to join me on Friday morning. I'll get back to responding to Andrew Perriman's view that Babylon of Revelation was Rome, not Jerusalem. And then Mike and I will be back together for Preterist Apologetics. Lord willing, nothing happens, okay? I'll see you on Friday.